Hey guys, welcome back. So today I thought it would be kind of cool to share with you guys some of the books that I was reading before joining Booktube. So I only joined Booktube this year in 2019, so it's only been like 5 or 6 months since I've started my channel. During that time, my reading tastes have changed quite a bit, and the things that I'm reading have changed quite a bit just because of the influence of Booktube and social media and that sort of thing. But I thought that it would be kind of an interesting idea to show you guys some of the things I was reading before Booktube so that you guys had an idea of what I was reading when I was just kind of left to my own devices. This is before I even knew Booktube existed. I kind of divided them up into different periods of my life, so I've got like 3 or 4 books for different times in my life to kind of give you guys an idea of what I was reading at the time. So without any further ado, let's get started. What I was reading when I was a kid. I chose a few books that I read when I was past the point of being read to, or when it was up to me whether or not I would read a book, not being read to by my parents. Some of the things that I gravitated towards as a child were things like E.B. White's Charlotte's Web, as well as The Trumpet of the Swan, I believe is also by E.B. White. I also got into Frances Hodgson Burnett's A Little Princess, the Beatrix Potter stories. I absolutely love these stories. Beatrix Potter is my hero, so I don't think I'm ever going to stop reading these. They've just been a huge part of my childhood, my teen years, and even now into my adult life, I am obsessed with the Beatrix Potter stories. I would say in and around like 8 to 10 years old, I was also starting to read C.S. Lewis a little bit. As a kid, I remember only reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and The Magician's Nephew, I think maybe in like middle school-ish age. Speaking of middle school, I'd say like 6th to 8th grade ish, I would call that middle school. I did not like reading. I didn't like reading at all, and there was very little that I actually did read. One of the things that I did read was the Septimus Heap series by Angie Sage. I loved these books, and I haven't read the 5th, 6th, or 7th books in the series, so I'm definitely interested in picking this series back up and finishing it from my childhood. Another book that meant a ton to me when I was younger was The Thief Lord by Cornelia Funk. This story takes place in Venice, Italy, and it is chock full of magic and adventure, and this story kind of got me a little bit obsessed with Venice, Italy for a lot of my childhood, and that fixation with Venice soon turned into an overall excitement about traveling and the world in general. So I think this book sparked a lot more of my own personality than I really realized at the time, but nowadays looking back on it, I'm like, this book was the start of my love of travel, and you'll see it in later years in some of my reading preferences. I started to get really into like travel memoirs and stuff because I wanted to learn about the world around me. So a couple of other books that I read when I was in middle school. I was in like 8th grade, which is probably a little bit old for these books, but that's fine. Teachers were like, you have to choose your library books. Choose your library books. We're leaving the library in like 5 minutes. This was the library at school. So I just went and grabbed 2 random books off the shelves, and it happened to be these books, and I happened to read them that week, and I adored them. Once Upon a Marigold by Jean Ferris. Again, this is probably a little bit younger of an age group than an 8th grade reader. And then another one, I've talked about it before, it is one of my favorite books of all time, and that is Horseradish by Lemony Snicket. Okay, so now we are getting into kind of my teen years, my high school years. These were the years that I really started to hate reading fiction and started to love reading nonfiction, probably because I had to do required reading in school. 3 of the books that I have here are fiction books, and 2 out of those 3 are books that I had to read for class because I told my teacher I would do a book report on them. There was still an element of like forced reading there, but I did really love these books. So a couple of the books that I did book reports on were The Prestige by Christopher Priest and Anansi Boys by Neil Gaiman. I loved both these books. I did, I think, a presentation on this one and a report on this one. Maybe. A couple of other books that I was reading at the time. I read the Hunger Games series because who didn't at that point? And I also did read the Divergent series, though I don't have those on my shelf anymore because I hated them so much that I didn't want them on my shelf. As I was saying before, I had a big love of travel at this point in my life. I would say the pinnacle of me loving travel, or the idea of travel, because I didn't really travel a whole lot when I was younger, but loving the concept of travel and learning about the world, I was at the pinnacle of it when I was about 14 years old, and in and around that time I went looking for books about travel, and I found this book. It's called 360 Degrees Longitude or Longitude, people say it differently. This book is by John Hyam, and I've discussed it here on this channel before. It's basically about this guy, John. It's a true story, and he took his wife and his 2 kids on a world traveling trip for a full year. So much fun to read. So if you are looking for a really good round the world travel memoir, definitely pick up 360 Degrees Longitude by John Hyam. At this time in my life, in and around my teen years, I was starting to get really into reading nonfiction. And I actually kind of credit this time in my life for getting me into kind of the scientific analytical mindset that eventually put me on track to get a biology degree. Looking back on some of the books that I was reading, it's kind of funny now thinking like, oh yeah, I definitely was meant for science. Yes, Tiny. My little boy was getting a little lonely, I guess, over there, so he's come to sit with me now. So I was going to talk about the nonfiction books that I was reading in and around my teen years. At the time, I started to get really into National Geographic. I was reading a lot of Traveler magazine, and I was also reading a lot of articles online on National Geographic's website. So that was a big part of my reading at the time. But I also just got really into learning about the world in general, learning little bits and bobs here and there. So I got into reading this book, which is The Answer Book by National Geographic. And basically the way that this book works is like there's like a 1 or 2 page spread on a whole bunch of different subjects. Some of them are like arts, some of them are science, some of them are like humanities and stuff like that. So there's not just scientific stuff in here. It's got a little bit of everything in it, and I loved books like this growing up. With my allowance at the time, I used to order National Geographic books. I also ordered the 10 Best of Everything, which is basically a book full of lists. So we've got stuff like the 10 best markets and food halls in the world, the 10 best airlines. I also got really into photography when I was in high school, so I ordered this book called Complete Photography by National Geographic. If you guys are interested in getting into photography, I do highly recommend this. It goes through pretty much everything about your actual camera itself. I believe it also teaches a little bit about the history of cameras, and it teaches you how to compose an image and how to basically just take a really great photo. Another book that I was really into, and this one I actually got into in like 8th grade. Then as I got into writing and like writing fantasy novels and stuff, I went back to it over and over again, and I still go back to it nowadays, and that was The Fantasy Cyclopedia by Judy Allen. Wonderful, wonderful book. It's kind of like a non-fiction format about fictional fairy tale creatures and stuff. You can learn a little bit about like general fairy lore in here. There's stuff about like zombies and vampires in here. Like there's all sorts of stuff. So it's definitely a really great option if you're interested in stuff like that. At this time, I also moved. For the first little while I was the new kid at school, I didn't really have a lot of friends. I was fairly shy. I got really into doing crafts and things like that. So I got really into knitting and sewing and embroidery and that sort of thing. Something that I was really into at the time was, as I said, knitting, but also history. And like the nerd that I am, this is the history of knitting book. And I have read a lot of it. I did a lot of knitting, and I was interested in history, so I found a book that was the history of knitting. This is why books are great. There are books about literally everything out there. So I was reading stuff like this. I was reading books about the history of craftsmanship, and I was also reading and using a lot of like how to draw books and stuff like that. I'm still not the greatest artist ever, but I'm working on it still. It's still a work in progress, and I still have a ton of those books in my closet, so still read crafts books to this day. Anyways, guys, that was pretty much my whirlwind tour of the types of books that I was reading before joining Booktube. Let me know down below in the comments if you guys have read any of the books that I was reading. Obviously, I think a lot of us have probably read like The Hunger Games, but let me know if you've read or even heard of some of the more obscure books that I've read. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you did enjoy this video, do not hesitate to like and subscribe for future videos. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.